want to say a word about the adults in the title. So I work with children and parents. So my adult patients are parents. But I've had the interesting experience in a number of settings, but particularly working at Austin Riggs, of presenting these ideas both to patients who've had early developmental trauma as well as clinicians who work with adults with early developmental trauma. And often both populations actually find that this material really resonates deeply with their experience. So I'm interested actually to hear from those of you who treat adults how these ideas do and do not make sense to you. But before I jump into that, I thought I would just tell you a little bit about my journey, how I come to be involved in this field and speaking to you about this. So, as Christine said, I'm a pediatrician, and my original interest in pediatrics actually came from Paulina Kernberg, because when I was in high school, of all things, I did an elective with her, and that involved doing an elective in child development. And then I thought, wow, as a pediatrician, you're really immersed in child development. And that's what I really wanted to do. But I was always interested in mental health, so kind of a preventive model of treatment of mental health. And I found that I did a very good pediatric residency at Einstein, and I actually did a fellowship in developmental and behavioral pediatrics. And then I was working at a very busy small town practice, actually right here in Great Barrington. And so I was kind of in the right place at the right time, but I never really felt that I had the tools to effectively help people. Are you okay in the back with my voice? Okay. So then I had the very good fortune that the Berkshire Psychoanalytic Institute had its first class in 2004, and they had a scholars program. So I joined that. So I was practicing pediatrics and I was studying psychoanalysis. And it was also coincidentally at the same time that there was the discovery of pediatric bipolar disorder. So I would have like kids as young as 15 months old that their parents were coming in and saying, do you think my child has bipolar disorder? And then I read Winnicott and Bowlby, and it was when I read Peter Fonagy that I felt, okay, this is the answer to everything. and that was actually when I wrote my first book, was about, okay, there's a totally different way to understand these kids and families and to work with them. But then, actually Ed Shapiro said to me, you should try out this infant mental health program in Boston. And so I checked it out and I said, oh, I absolutely have to go there. So that's where I've been since actually 2010. And I'm just going to tell you a little bit about it, because people may not even be familiar with the term infant mental health. How many of you have a sense of what that means? Yeah, so it's kind of a problematic term in my view. That's why I call it the developmental science of early childhood. But really what it is it's kind of the interface. Oh, are you going to get me a mic?
There's also this one.
That's great. Of developmental.
You needed to blow it.
All right. So I have to hold it? I guess so. All right, I'll do that. Let me try if I put it in here. Yeah. Okay. Is this good? Okay. Great. So where was I? The interface of developmental psychology, neuroscience, and genetics into a model of prevention, early intervention, and treatment. And it really has applications way beyond infancy. So I went out to Boston, and I'm just going to tell you a little bit about this program. So it's led by Ed Tronick. How many of you are familiar with the work of Ed Tronick? So he, about 30 to 35 people every 2 years gather for a 3-day weekend every other month. And the leaders in the field come to this group. So, and the people in the group are really as amazing as the people who come and teach the group. So there are people from all over the world, like from Guatemala, from Germany, from Seattle, from Virginia, and they're from the aggregate is actually 40. So people well advanced in their professional lives, many of them. Psychoanalysts, occupational therapists, educators, early childhood educators. So we hang out with these world-renowned researchers for 3 days. So Peter Fonagy comes, so you really kind of live in these ideas and wrestle with them, and Ed leads us in challenging these people, not just saying, okay, bow down to Fonagy's holiness, but wait, I saw this kid, and that doesn't fit with what happened for me, and that's the kind of environment that we live in there. So that's kind of how I come to know all the things that I'm going to talk with you about today. And it's really been, this is Barry Brazelton, who is a world-renowned pediatrician who's actually alive and pretty well at the age of 99. So they recently honored him at an event in October. And so he has been a very big influence on Ed. And one of his major contributions was that in seeing in the course of his pediatric practice, he recognized that when there's a developmental leap for a child, it's often preceded by significant disorganization. So this kind of describes my experience in the infant parent mental health program. So as I said, I thought Fonagy was the answer to everything. I could understand everything that happened in my office because of mentalization. And then I went and I heard Porges, and I heard Bruce Perry, and I immersed and every weekend, after every weekend, I would come back and I would be very disorganized, and I would sort of gradually integrate all of these ideas into an increasingly coherent model. And I actually was asked, I did some work as an assistant faculty member, and then for the last cohort who just graduated, I was actually on the faculty, so I got to see this, every one of these all over again. So this is kind of, I wouldn't say it's by any means a finished product, because I look back at what I knew 10 years ago and I think, what the heck was I doing? And that may be true 10 years from now. But so this is the kind of conceptual model that I've put together as of today. And it's really kind of, all of us now I consider myself an infant mental health specialist, kind of self-taught. All of what I'm going to talk with you about is just kind of a frame to hold in your head, because really what we do with our clients or patients is we sit and we listen to them. But how do we listen, and how do we structure what we're hearing? And so this is what I'm hoping to offer you today. And I'm going to just throw out a case. Now this is kind of a generic case. I've changed the details to disguise the family. I would still ask you not to discuss this outside of this room. So I'm going to go right into the material, but I'm just going to put this out there, because then at the end I'm going to come back to this family. So this is kind of the average, almost every family that comes to see me is the chief complaint is that he never listens or she never listens. I don't know if those of you who work with young kids have a similar experience. And then often right after that, especially in this day and age, where a lot of young kids are diagnosed with psychiatric disorders, comes the question, does he have ADHD or autism? The mother presents herself as feeling like a failure. She presents the dad to me as working all the time and having an explosive temper. It was a very stressful pregnancy, and she had postpartum anxiety. Max, as an infant, cried all the time, and in the current situation, really nobody in the household is sleeping.
Could you turn up the volume?
I tried that trick again.
Move it closer.
You know what? I wonder if I could just move this around
Yeah.
so that it's closer to where I am. Let's try that. How's that?
Oh, perfect.
Okay, great. Okay, so I think of these as like layers of complexity, and I kind of added them one by one over the years, and I feel like they're all, I feel very attached to them. So even though it's a lot, I couldn't really take any of them out. So you'll just have to bear with me, and hopefully it will come together as a big pattern by the end. So the first is the work of Stephen Porges and the biology of safety. Are any of you familiar with this? Okay, great. So hopefully I'll make you a little bit more familiar with it today. So I feel like this has to come first. So hopefully all of you feel safe here, so you can think and you can actually listen to me and you can take in what I'm saying. I feel safe because I have so many friends in the audience. So safety is really the first thing that has to happen before anything can happen. And so Stephen Porges described what he calls the polyvagal theory of emotions, and the transformative, and he talks about the transformative power of feeling safe. So I'll tell you a little bit about, it's a very complex theory, but I want to try to give you the basic take-home points that I think have relevance to what we do every day. So he's a neuroscientist. He's not a therapist. He's become like the hottest thing on the trauma circuit. So he speaks with Bessel van der Kolk all the time. So people who have experienced trauma, people who work with people who have experienced trauma, just glommed on to his work, and it's very powerful. But just to give you an idea where it came from, because he was just in the lab studying neuroscience, and particularly he was studying the parasympathetic nervous system, which is mediated by the vagal nerve. So many of us know about the fight-flight response, which is mediated by the sympathetic nervous system. And I remember from medical school, actually, sort of the depiction of the two nervous systems side by side. There's the parasympathetic and the sympathetic, and it was kind of taught to us that those are the two ways of interacting with the world. So when you're sort of under the influence of the parasympathetic system, you're available for social engagement, you can make eye contact, you can connect with people. And when you're flooded with the sympathetic system, it puts you in the fight-flight response. So these were kind of thought to be the two options of interacting with the environment. And so he was writing about this and very prolific in his research. And then one day he got a letter from a neonatologist. And he writes about how really the parasympathetic is almost like it was the good system, the healthy system. And this person wrote to him and said, in my NICU, the vagus nerve kills babies. And so Porges was like, what? And so he talked about how babies, very premature babies, under the influence of vagal tone, their blood pressure falls and they stop breathing. So he was very puzzled by this. How is it that something that actually promotes our social engagement and is thought to be such a positive aspect of human nature would have this other effect? So I wouldn't say he discovered another branch, but he came to appreciate that there are two branches of the vagus. And one is the myelinated, sort of the advanced version of the vagus. And then there's the unmyelinated branch, which he calls the primitive vagus. And it's the primitive vagus that makes your blood pressure fall. It's like what mediates what we would call dissociation, or for an animal, playing dead. So really then he calls the two model like it's sympathocentric. So it's really there are three distinct ways that we interact with our environment. So there's the one way, which is when we feel safe, which is the parasympathetic system, or the ventral vagal, the myelinated vagal, social engagement system. And then there's danger, which is the sympathetic system, rapid heart rate, increased blood pressure, hyperarousal. But then there's this third way, which is mediated by this unmyelinated vagus, this thing that's killing babies in the NICU, where you have overwhelming threat. And then there's hypoarousal, decreased heart rate, and immobilization, as I was saying, when an animal plays dead. So then he, recognizing that social connection is really a biological imperative. So when we need social connection to manage our physiology, and it protects against the harmful effects of stress. So he coined this term, neuroception, like how do we know that we're in a safe place, or a place that we need to run from, or a place that causes us to shut down. And he describes that it's like we have inside our own personal TSA agent who scouts out, like, how dangerous a situation are we in right now. So I'll just describe these three states. So in this, when we are open to receive a hug, when we can connect with other people, the myelinated branch of the parasympathetic is active, we can relax, and the vagus plays a role in innervation of the muscles of the face, larynx, and middle ear. So these muscles, which actually humans have 42 muscles in their face alone, and many more that control the tone or prosody of voice, and so the smart vagus can do all of that. So then when we have fear, we go into this middle way of reacting to the environment, and that's the fight-flight that we're familiar with, where we either fight or we run away. And that's mediated by what's called the hypothalamic pituitary adrenal axis. But then there's this third way. So when we feel overwhelming threat, for an animal, as I was saying, you play dead, the heart rate slows, the blood pressure falls, and you're not able to have social engagement, but you actually can't even listen. So the primitive vagus interacts with the muscles to the bones of the middle ear, so that the way you take in sound is actually distorted. So you may have patients who, under extreme stress, they become very hypersensitive to sounds, and certainly kids who are on the autism spectrum have that, and Porges has this whole theory of how variations in the parasympathetic system are responsible for a lot of those core features of autism. So you lose the ability to discern the full range of sounds, and the expressive range of facial muscles is impaired. So why is this relevant? So because this freeze, this what we call dissociation, this primitive vagal, may be in charge when you're a parent. So your kid in some way provokes you, let's say in the grocery store, and stresses you out and pushes your buttons in some way, and you can't leave. So it's experienced by your body as threatening. And so what may happen then is that your primitive vagus is in charge of your body. And I'm going to talk about the still face later on. So what happens for the child is that their parent is there, looks like their parent, but somehow there's something not right about the way they're looking at them. They're just not really themselves. So that's one place that it's very relevant. And then the other is in the therapist's office, because there you are. I mean, it's particularly problematic, I would say, for like when a family goes for an evaluation to a child psychiatrist, because here they are absolutely terrified that there's something wrong with their child. And they go in and they may look very calm and put together, but their body is in this kind of state of feeling threatened. And then someone starts just asking them questions. And so you sort of lost the whole game already. So really this model, the reason I said I can't do a talk without talking about the polyvagal theory, because I think it really explains why something that we all know as therapists, that time and safe space is a central aspect of the treatment. So literally, I mean, I used to see patients at 15 minutes visits, which was really problematic, for refill of their ADHD meds. And when I started doing exclusively behavioral pediatrics, I said, no, every visit has to be an hour. And it made such a difference, because it really takes the first half hour or so for the feeling of threat to subside, even if you know the family well. They've been out in the outside world, which is their experience is stressful. So that experience of your voice, I mean, this is all very Winnicottian too, like the reliability of the appointment time, the comfort of the office, all of those things are really the polyvagal theory explains why those are all critical aspects of treatment. So that's the first layer. So the second, this started, as I said, was the way I understood life, the universe, and everything, was from Peter Fonagy's work. So I'm going to go over this a little bit more briefly because I think some of it may be more familiar to some of you. You know, there's 40, 50 years of attachment research showing that secure early relationships promote emotional regulation, cognitive resourcefulness, social competence, resilience, and overall mental health. So the work of Peter Fonagy and colleagues, which started in like the early 90s, where they kind of took apart the attachment interview and the strange situation and found that a key aspect of secure attachment was what they termed mentalization. Now, that's another word that I'm very close to Peter Fonagy, but I tell him it's a terrible word. It's just not a kind of a user-friendly word, but reflective function is kind of the same thing, and I think it's a little bit more user-friendly. But so this is where I had my kind of aha moment back in the early 2000s, when rather than telling people what to do, which is what pediatricians do, I would instead just see my task as helping the parent to be curious about the meaning of their child's behavior. And so that was what I wrote my first book about. And then I also was very influenced by the work of Arietta Slade, who took Fonagy's concept of mentalization and applied it to parents. So she developed something called the parent development interview and described this more specific concept of parental reflective functioning, and described how when we work with parents and children, that's really our primary task, is to have a parent shift from non-reflective, like tell me what to do, he's so bad, you know, I send him to his room, he doesn't listen, to you know, having a little brother and us not sleeping, I wonder if that's affecting him. So making that shift. And so she has a definition of mentalization that I then borrowed and both broke down into these different components. So as I've been talking about, it's curiosity. So you may not have any idea why your child is...
Her name again?
Oh, Arietta Slade. Why? And sometimes parents say, well, they ask their child, but the child certainly doesn't know why. So really you don't have to know the answer, but the point is that you are interested in the why, and you're curious. And then the second is empathy. And empathy means recognizing that your child's feeling is a significant feeling, even though it's not yours. And Peter Fonagy talks about something called marked mirroring, so that when your child is crying, you don't like scream in the exact same way, but you reflect back their experience, and then they begin to take ownership of their own emotional experience and see it as distinct from yours. And then the other important component is limit setting and containment. I think a lot of times, initially when people hear this concept, they think it's very kind of indulgent, and that's, you know, it couldn't be further from the truth, because reflective functioning means helping your child to contain their big feelings, and that part of that behaviorally is actually limit setting. And then the fourth, which is probably the most difficult, as I was talking about the mother in the grocery store, is to regulate your own feelings, because children have a way of really significantly pushing our buttons. So these are all the things that go into holding a child in mind. And so, you know, in addition to creating the safe environment, the next layer is really just creating an opportunity to facilitate parental reflective functioning, which just means, again, it's kind of a fancy way of saying listening, but it gives you a model of why it is you're doing this. So you're helped by being present and just listening to the parent's story in a kind of non-judgmental way, without intervening with a lot of questions, you're sort of helping to guide that parent to being curious by your very presence listening to them. And another way of saying that is to contain the parent's experience, supports contain the infant's experience, and then putting the last few slides together, that mental reflective functioning promotes emotional regulation, cognitive resourcefulness, social competence, and resilience. So that really, I think, is another layer when you're in the room with a parent and a child to be a significant part of the frame of what you're listening for. But that's very parent-focused. So the other piece is, who is this child? And as a pediatrician, I would go and do my rounds, and back in the day when I was practicing pediatrics, which I think is so sad that this doesn't happen anymore, but we would actually go and see the babies in the hospital. Now there are hospitalists who do that. And I would go in the morning, and the nurses would tell me, oh, this baby's so sweet and quiet, and this baby's going to be a handful. So right from birth, the nurses would identify the babies as really being quite different from each other in very significant ways. And I find now, when I work with a parent, even if their child is like 17, they'll say to me, oh, he's been like this since birth. So when you take the time to really hear the story, I not always, but and they don't always say this right off the bat, but then, details come out about that give you an appreciation for what I would term biological vulnerabilities. So I'm going to just talk a little bit about that. So there are different ways that we talk about this. One of the main ones is temperament. And actually, through the program in Boston, I've had the opportunity to listen to Nancy Sneidman, who works with Jerome Kagan, who has done the major temperament research. And so it's really interesting that the original studies of temperament that separated babies at 4 months of age into high reactive, low reactive, anyway, they're based on sensory experience, so that the high reactive, they're given something, a visual stimuli, or an auditory stimulus, and then they're divided that way. So clinically, I've always found that it's much more useful to think about sensory processing than temperament, because that can, as I'm going to talk about, that can really get you into a more mentalizing stance, rather than saying, oh, this is just a slow to warm up child, which has a kind of a slightly judgmental, slightly inflexible quality to it. So these are, and another thing which I'm going to talk about a little bit is state regulation. So babies are very different in terms of how easily they transition from one state to another. So some babies are, wide awake, and they have that wonderful mutual gaze period, and then they start to get a little fussy, and then they start to escalate, and then you feed them, and then they fall asleep, and that's kind of how you spend your day. And then there are other babies just scream and scream and scream and scream and then fall asleep. And so, and this is a biologically based quality, that the difference from baby to baby, but obviously has a tremendous impact on the caregiver. Another way we talk about biological differences is in terms of, this is actually probably the most common way, what babies do, their behavior, so how they sleep, how much they cry, and feeding. So those are different ways to think about and listen for biological differences when you're working with a family. And at Austin Riggs we have the benefit, of often having, even with adults, the family come in so that you have access to that early history, which can be very helpful in making sense of what's going on even for an adult. So I always like to use this quote. Daphne Merkin actually came and spoke at Riggs a month or so ago. She's written a book recently about her experience with depression. She's also written for the New York Times. This is actually a quote from an article in the New York Times, which I just think is very powerful. She says, "It is an affliction that often starts young and goes unheeded, younger than would seem possible, as if in exiting the womb I was enveloped in a gray and itchy wool blanket instead of a soft pastel-colored bunting. And I just think it's a very vivid image, and when you listen really carefully to parents, you often, for kids who are struggling, you hear that that the world perhaps felt that way to them. And parents often have no idea what to do with a baby who experiences the world like that. Okay, so why then are babies so different from each other? And so having an understanding of that can also help guide us in listening to the story of an individual family. So one very common reason is drugs. So, I mean, right now we're in the midst of an opiate epidemic, and that's a huge problem with babies experiencing what's called neonatal abstinence syndrome. Prematurity. Now, prematurity is an interesting issue because very premature babies are in the NICU, so they get a lot of services. But there's a particularly vulnerable population, which are called the late preterm and even the early term baby, who tend to be in the regular nursery, but their temperature control isn't as good, their signals are more difficult to read, they may be kind of pokey feeders, and yet they're in the regular nursery, and if we don't kind of identify that this is actually an issue, this, I'm going to talk about mutual regulation, but this can often kind of spiral into a problematic pattern between the parent and the baby. And then there's, I'm going to venture into another complicated field just for a little while. Is everyone still with me? Okay. So there's genetics. So sometimes I'll hear a family and they'll describe generations of these fussy babies. And some of them went on to grew up to have a range of psychiatric disorders. So there is some is yet to be identified genetics. I think some of that is also related to sensory processing, but this is an emerging field of knowledge. But then there's epigenetics. And so I'm going to just talk a little bit about what is epigenetics. Is this a term familiar to people? Okay. So, I mean, it was familiar to me for years before I actually knew what it was. So, and my daughter does research at Emory, and I went to her lab, and there's a picture of epigenetics, and it is a zillion times more complicated than the way I understand it. But I'm going to explain it to you in a way that I think is relevant clinically to the work we do. So what it means is above the gene. So you have the DNA strand, and there's base pairs. So if you have something like Duchenne's muscular dystrophy or cystic fibrosis, one base pair is absent or missing, or it's the wrong one, and that is not something that can be influenced by the environment. But the gene expression changes based on the way molecules are attached to that gene sequence. So epigenetics involves changes to the DNA structure, not to the base pairs, that alter gene expression and hence individual characteristics, but do not involve changes to the gene sequence. So these changes in turn, where different molecules are added or taken off, regulate how the genes are turned on and off. So what does this mean in real life? So parents say to me, I worry that he's going to have depression like his Uncle Charlie. So you can have a genetic vulnerability, but the effects of that gene on your behavior will vary according to the environment. So whether the genes are expressed in turn directly affects the developing structure and biochemistry of the brain. So in other words, experience shapes genetic potential, and early life relationships are critical in influencing the development of the brain. So if any of you are interested in learning, there's this great website, Lick Your Rats, where you get to actually do this in real life, maybe not in real life, but in an animated way, so it helps to get the idea in, because the original epigenetics research was in rats. And so Francis Champagne and Michael Meany have found these two different populations of rats. There's the high licking and grooming rat mothers, and their rat pups grew up to become adult rats. But the low licking and grooming rat mothers produce anxious adult rats. So it wasn't that they inherited the temperamental trait, but the actual experience of being licked and groomed changed the gene expression in the rat pup. Going back to the dysregulated baby, the intrauterine environment also can change the gene expression. So there you have genes, genetic and epigenetic effects together in utero. And this is just a quote from a study. Infants of mothers who were depressed during pregnancy have greater methylation of genes implicated in functioning of the hypothalamic pituitary adrenal axis. And these infants show poorer self-regulation and more hypotonia and lethargy. So you have kind of a double whammy where the mom is depressed and her depression is affecting her baby, and then the baby is born, and so the baby is maybe more difficult to read their signals. They may be a pokey feeder, so you have already, just right at the moment of birth, this kind of vulnerable dyad. But the bottom line is biology is not destiny. So this is, I think, how it can affect our work. I mean, I don't actually use the word epigenetics with families, but I try to convey this concept that it's not, set in stone that your child is going to suffer in the way other family members have. So we can think of mentalization and mutual regulation, that I'm going to talk about in a little bit, as the human equivalents of licking and grooming. So when infants feel held, it helps the brain and stress response system develop in a healthy way. But in contrast, in a stressed environment, they may develop an altered stress response at the level of gene expression. Okay, so just putting these things together. So as I was saying, that one of our objectives in working with parents and children is to support curiosity about the meaning of behavior and a child's capacity to make sense of her experience of the world. And I just have to share this with a recent story I heard, because it kind of puts the two ideas together. So you have a child who has this biological vulnerability, so what do you do about it? You help them make sense of it. So I had this kid who was doing really well and then had kind of a resurgence of explosive behavior. And the parents came in, and we had that nice expansive time to say, what's going on? They didn't know what was going on. And as they were telling the story, Mom was talking about there was a change in the school setting where they went into a different classroom, and there were all these things that were different, including that the muffins were squishy. And it was such a great deal.